The smell hit them first before they even saw the food. Warm bread, yeast and wheat mingling with something rich and fatty, pork fat crackling in its own juices. The Japanese women prisoners stood frozen on the San Francisco dock, their emaciated bodies swaying with exhaustion, their minds unable to process what their noses were telling them. For 2 years they had been taught that Americans were demons who would torture them, starve them, parade them through streets like animals. Yet here, on American soil, someone was cooking them a feast. Nurse Akiko Yamada gripped the railing of the transport ship, her knuckles white against the cold metal. Below her, American soldiers moved with purpose, unloading crates and setting up what looked like, impossibly, a field kitchen. Steam rose from massive pots. A woman in a Red Cross uniform was slicing bread, thick slices that fell like pillows onto metal trays. Akiko's stomach clenched painfully. She had not seen bread like that since before the war, before Guam fell, before everything fell. Beside her, Fumiko whispered, "It's a trick. They want us to trust them before they kill us." Fumiko had been a teacher's wife in Manila before the occupation collapsed. Now she was gaunt, her hair streaked with premature gray, her eyes darting constantly as if searching for the trap she knew must be coming. They all looked like that now, all 63 women who had been crammed into the cargo hold for the 2-week journey across the Pacific. Their cheeks were hollowed, their collarbones sharp beneath thin cotton prison uniforms. Several could barely walk. "Maybe," Akiko murmured, though she did not believe it. She had been a prisoner long enough to recognize the difference between calculated cruelty and simple indifference. This smelled like neither. The gangplank descended with a metallic clang that made several women flinch. An American officer stepped forward, a middle-aged man with kind eyes and a clipboard. He spoke in halting, heavily accented Japanese. "Welcome to San Francisco. You are prisoners of war, but you will be treated according to the Geneva Convention. You will be fed, given medical care, and housed in proper facilities. Please proceed down the gangplank in an orderly fashion." No one moved. The women stared at him as if he had spoken in an alien tongue, though his Japanese, poor as it was, had been clear enough. The officer looked confused, then concerned. He turned to a young Nisei translator beside him, a Japanese-American woman in a crisp military uniform. "Tell them again," he said in English. "Tell them they're safe." The translator stepped forward, her Japanese fluid and perfect. "I know you're frightened. I know what they told you about us. But you are on American soil now, and here we follow laws. You will not be harmed. Please come down. There is food waiting, and you need to eat." Akiko felt Fumiko's hand grip her arm. "What if it's poisoned? Then we die with full stomachs for once," Akiko said, and she did not know if she was joking. She took the first step down the gangplank. The others followed, shuffling like ghosts, their eyes wide and wary. When Akiko's feet touched American soil, she expected something: a blow, a shout, shackles. Instead, a Red Cross nurse approached her with a blanket. "You must be cold," the nurse said through the translator. "Here, wrap this around yourself." The wool was thick and warm, military issue but clean and soft. Akiko took it numbly, unable to form words. Around her, other women were being given blankets, each one received with the same stunned silence. One woman, the elderly widow of a naval officer, began to cry silently, tears streaming down her weathered face as she clutched the blanket to her chest. They were herded gently toward long tables that had been set up beside the field kitchen. The smell of food grew stronger with each step. Akiko's vision blurred with hunger. She had not eaten anything but thin rice gruel and occasional fish scraps for months. The last time she had tasted meat was before her capture on Guam, in the days when the Japanese garrison still had supplies, before the Americans invaded and everything descended into chaos. She remembered that night, the explosions walking up the beach, the screams of wounded soldiers, the way her hospital had filled with the dying faster than she could treat them. She remembered the order to evacuate, the mad scramble to the docks, and then the torpedo that turned the water to fire. She had watched women drown, their arms outstretched, their mouths open in silent screams beneath the waves. The survivors had been pulled from the water by American sailors and immediately transferred to a prison camp in New Guinea. That was where the propaganda had really started, where the Japanese officers in the camp had told them daily that the Americans would rape them, torture them, use them for medical experiments. When you are transferred to America, they had said, you will be put on display in zoos. You will be starved and beaten for the entertainment of American crowds. It is better to die with honor than to suffer such shame. Some women had believed it enough to try. Akiko had treated 3 suicide attempts in the New Guinea camp, all unsuccessful, all resulting in punishment that made the would-be victims wish they had succeeded. After that, they had all simply endured, waiting for the death they believed was coming. But this did not look like death. This looked like dinner. An American soldier, young and nervous, was ladling something into tin bowls. As Akiko approached, she saw that it was stew, thick with vegetables and chunks of meat. Real meat, pork or beef, she could not tell. Only that it was there, solid and glistening in brown gravy. The soldier handed her a bowl with a shy smile. She took it automatically, her hands shaking. Bread, the Red Cross nurse said, pressing 2 thick slices into her free hand. The bread was still warm. Akiko could feel the heat through her palms, could see the butter melting into golden pools on the surface. She looked up at the translator, who had stayed close to help ease the transition. This is for us? Yes, all of it. Eat as much as you want. But why? The translator paused, searching for words. Because that's the rule. Prisoners are supposed to be fed. That's the law here. Akiko sat at one of the long benches, the bowl cradled in her lap like something precious and fragile. Around her, the other women were sitting too, each holding their own portions, each wearing the same expression of disbelief. No one ate. They simply stared at the food as if it might vanish or transform into something terrible if they looked away. Fumiko sat beside her, breathing heavily. If this is poisoned, I want you to know you were a good friend. If this is poisoned, I won't care, Akiko replied, and she lifted the spoon to her lips. The first taste of stew exploded across her tongue, salt and fat and something herbal she could not identify. The meat was tender, falling apart at the touch of her teeth. The gravy was rich enough to make her eyes water. She swallowed, waited for the pain or the burning that would signal poison. But there was nothing except warmth spreading through her chest and the desperate, animal need for more. She ate the entire bowl without stopping, scraping the sides with her bread, soaking up every drop of gravy. The bread itself was a revelation, soft and yeasty with a crisp crust that crackled between her teeth. It tasted like civilization, like normal life, like everything they had lost when the war began. Around her, the other women had begun eating too, first tentatively, then with growing desperation. The widow was crying openly now, shoving bread into her mouth with both hands, crumbs falling down her uniform front. A young nurse named Haruko was eating so fast she choked, coughing and sputtering until the Red Cross nurse rushed over with water. Slowly, the American nurse said through the translator. You'll make yourselves sick. There's more, plenty more. But they could not slow down. They had been starving for too long. The food was a drug, better than any mercy, sweeter than any promise. Akiko felt it filling the hollow places inside her. Not just her stomach, but something deeper. Some part of her that had been emptied by fear and loss and the constant expectation of death. When she finally set down her empty bowl, she felt dizzy. Her stomach cramped, unused to such richness. But she also felt something else, something she had not felt in years. She felt almost human again. The American officer with the clipboard approached their table, the translator beside him. We're going to transport you to a facility inland. It's a camp, but it's clean and there are real beds. You'll be processed there, given medical exams, assigned quarters. Is anyone here injured or too ill to travel? Several women raised their hands weakly. Akiko looked them over with a nurse's eye. Malnutrition, mostly, and the lingering effects of tropical diseases. Nothing immediately life-threatening, but all of them would need treatment. I am a nurse, she said in careful English, the words rusty from disuse. I can help. The officer's eyebrows rose. You speak English? A little. I trained at hospital in Osaka. English was required. That's very helpful, thank you. He made a note on his clipboard. What's your name? Yamada Akiko, nurse. From Guam Hospital. Thank you, Nurse Yamada. We'll make sure you're assigned to assist our medical staff. He paused, studying her with those kind, tired eyes. I'm sorry for what you've been through. I know you probably don't believe that, but it's true. This war has been hard on everyone. Akiko did not know what to say to that. The idea that an American officer might feel sympathy for Japanese prisoners was so foreign to everything she had been taught that she could not process it. She simply nodded and looked away. The buses that took them inland were military vehicles, old and loud but clean. The women sat in stunned silence as the California landscape rolled past the windows. Green hills and sprawling farms, houses with lights in the windows, cars on the roads. It looked peaceful. It looked untouched by war. For women who had lived through bombings and evacuations and the constant fear of death, the normalcy was almost obscene. Where are the ruins? Fumiko whispered. They told us America was suffering. They said the people were starving, that the cities were being bombed. They lied, Akiko said simply. The camp, when they reached it, was not the barbed wire and guard towers they had expected. It was a converted school, a low sprawling building surrounded by a high fence, but the fence looked almost decorative compared to the electrified barriers of the New Guinea camp. There were guards, yes, but they stood at ease, smoking cigarettes and chatting with each other. One of them waved at the bus as it passed. Inside, they were processed with bureaucratic efficiency. Names recorded, photographs taken, medical histories documented. The medical exam was conducted by a female doctor, an older woman with gentle hands who'd sked over their visible ribs and swollen bellies, the telltale signs of prolonged starvation. We'll start you on a feeding program, she said through the translator. Small meals, frequently, to rebuild your strength. And vitamins, you all need vitamins desperately. She looked at Akiko. You're the nurse. Yes, ma'am. Good. I'll need your help. These women are in bad shape, but nothing we can't fix with time and care. She smiled and it reached her eyes. Welcome to California, Nurse Yamada. I'm sorry it's under these circumstances. That night, Akiko lay in a real bed for the first time in 2 years. It was a narrow cot with a thin mattress, but it had clean sheets and a pillow and a wool blanket. Above her, a ceiling fan turned lazily, stirring the warm air. Through the window, she could see stars, clear and bright in a sky unbroken by searchlights or tracer fire. Beside her, Fumiko whispered, I don't understand. Why are they being kind? What do they want from us? I don't know, Akiko admitted. Maybe they want nothing. Maybe this is just who they are. That's impossible. Everyone wants something. Maybe, Akiko said, but she thought of the bread, warm in her hands, and the nurse with the gentle touch, and the officer with the kind eyes. She thought of the blanket and the stew and the bed beneath her back. None of it felt like a trick. It felt like something simpler and more terrifying than cruelty. Felt like mercy. In the days that followed, the pattern continued. 3 meals a day, each one abundant by the standards they had known. Breakfast was oatmeal with milk and sugar, eggs when available, always with bread and butter. Lunch was sandwiches or soup, thick with vegetables and meat. Dinner was the best, hot meals that varied, roasted chicken one night, beef stew the next, pork chops with mashed potatoes. There was always dessert, cookies or cake or fruit in heavy syrup. The women ate like refugees because that was what they were. Their bodies, starved for so long, hoarded every calorie. Within a week, the sharpest edges of their hunger had dulled. Within 2 weeks, some color had returned to their faces. Within a month, they looked almost human again, though the shadows remained in their eyes. Akiko worked with the camp doctor, treating minor ailments and administering vitamins. The work was familiar, comforting in its routine. It reminded her of the hospital in Guam, before everything went wrong. She tried not to think about the patients she had lost there, the soldiers who had died in her arms, the civilians caught in the crossfire. War had a way of making everyone a victim, regardless of which flag they served. The other prisoners began to relax, slowly, like animals learning that the hand that feeds will not also strike. They formed small communities, sharing stories and memories, trying to maintain some connection to the lives they had lost. The teachers' wives taught classes in English and mathematics. The nurses organized exercise programs to rebuild their strength. The older women, the ones who had been officers' wives, maintained a dignified reserve, but even they could not hide their relief at being alive and fed. Letters were allowed, heavily censored but allowed nonetheless. Akiko wrote to her sister in Osaka, not knowing if the letter would ever arrive, not even knowing if her sister was still alive. The last she had heard, Osaka was being bombed regularly. But she wrote anyway, describing the California weather and the food and the strange kindness of their captors. She did not mention the guilt she felt, the nagging sense that accepting American mercy was a betrayal of some kind. In the third month, they were moved to a larger facility in Arizona, a proper internment camp that housed Japanese-American families as well as prisoners of war. The camp was enormous, a small city unto itself, with schools and shops and even a baseball diamond. The barracks were simple but clean, and each family had their own space, partitioned by curtains for privacy. The women prisoners were housed separately from the internees, but they saw them at meals and during recreational activities. It was strange, seeing Japanese faces in American clothes, speaking English with American accents, children playing baseball and singing American songs. These were not the enemy, but they were not quite allies either. They existed in some liminal space, neither fully Japanese nor fully American, and Akiko found herself envying their confusion because at least they had options. The food remained good, plentiful in a way that seemed almost wasteful after years of rationing. There was meat at almost every meal, vegetables in varieties she had never seen before, bread that never ran out. The camp had its own bakery, and the smell of fresh bread became a constant comfort, a reminder that they were safe, that they would not starve, that whatever else happened, they would be fed. One evening, as Akiko sat on the steps of her barack, watching the sun set over the desert, a young Japanese-American girl approached her. The girl was maybe 10 years old, wearing a neat dress and carrying a book. "Are you really from Japan?" the girl asked in English. "Yes," Akiko replied carefully. "I am from Osaka. What's it like there? My grandma talks about it, but she left when she was young. She says she barely remembers." Akiko considered the question. What was Osaka like? Beautiful and ancient and crowded and poor and probably in ruins now. "It is very different from here. More people, older buildings. We have temples that are hundreds of years old." "Do you miss it?" "Every day." The girl nodded as if this made perfect sense. "My dad is in the army. He's fighting in Italy. My mom says he's fighting to prove we're American, even though we're in a camp. I think that's sad." "It is sad," Akiko agreed. "Do you think the war will end soon?" "I hope so." The girl smiled and ran off to join her friends, leaving Akiko alone with her thoughts. The girl's father was fighting for America while his family was imprisoned by America, and somehow this was supposed to make sense. The logic of war, Akiko supposed, had never been particularly logical. Winter came, cold and harsh in the desert. The barracks had heating, inadequate but present, and they were given extra blankets and warmer clothes. On Christmas Day, the camp administrators organized a feast, turkey and ham and all the trimmings, desserts piled high on serving tables. It was absurd, celebrating an American holiday as prisoners, but after the meal, Fumiko leaned over and whispered, "I think I'm getting too comfortable here." "Me too," Akiko admitted. "Is that bad?" "I don't know. Maybe it's just survival. Maybe we're supposed to adapt. Or maybe," Fumiko said quietly, "we're forgetting who we are." That thought haunted Akiko through the winter. Was she betraying her country by accepting this treatment? Should she be resisting, refusing the food, maintaining her hatred of the enemy? But how could she hate people who fed her, who gave her work that had meaning, who treated her illness and respected her skills? The Americans had become human to her, not demons but ordinary people doing their jobs, and that realization felt like a betrayal of everything she had been taught. In January of 1944, news reached the camp that the Allies had landed at Anzio. The war in Europe was turning. In the Pacific, American forces were island-hopping toward Japan, each battle bringing them closer to the homeland. Akiko listened to the news with a strange numbness. Part of her hope Japan would win, would push back the invaders, would prove that all the sacrifice had meaning. But another part, a part she did not want to acknowledge, hoped the war would simply end, regardless of who won, because she was tired of death and suffering and the impossible moral calculations that war demanded. Spring brought warmer weather and news of more American victories. Guam was retaken in July. Akiko learned this from a guard who mentioned it casually, not realizing what the island meant to her. She excused herself and went to her barack and cried for the first time since her capture. She cried for the hospital and the patients she had lost. She cried for the soldiers who had tried to defend the island. She cried for the world that had existed before December of 1941. The world where she had been simply a nurse, not a prisoner, not an enemy, just a young woman with a future that made sense. Fumiko found her there, sitting on her cot with her face in her hands. She sat beside Akiko and said nothing, just placed a hand on her shoulder and waited. After a long time, Akiko said, "I don't know who I am anymore." "None of us do," Fumiko replied. "The war took that from us. Maybe we'll figure it out when it's over." "What if it's never over? What if we're prisoners forever?" "Then we survive anyway. That's what we do. We survive." The months passed. Summer heat baked the camp, turning the barracks into ovens. Fall brought relief and news of more victories. The Philippines liberated, American bombers striking Japanese cities. Winter came again, the second winter of their captivity, and with it a strange kind of routine. They were still prisoners, still confined, but they were also safe and fed and cared for in ways that made captivity feel almost tolerable. In February of 1945, Akiko was called to the camp administrator's office. She went with trepidation, unsure what this summons meant. The administrator was a tired-looking man in his 50s, a former teacher who had been drafted into managing the camp. "Nurse Yamada," he said, gesturing for her to sit. "I wanted to discuss your status. We've been monitoring the war's progress, and it's becoming clear that Japan will likely surrender within the year. When that happens, we'll begin repatriation processes for prisoners who wish to return to Japan. I wanted to ask if that's something you'd want." Akiko stared at him, unable to process the question. Return to Japan? To what? Her home city was being bombed regularly. Her family might be dead. The country she remembered no longer existed, replaced by something desperate and fanatical, willing to sacrifice everything for a war it could not win. "I don't know," she said finally. "What are the other options?" "Some prisoners may be allowed to remain in the United States, especially those with valuable skills. Medical professionals, for instance, are always in demand. It would require an extensive vetting process, but it's possible." "You would let an enemy nurse stay in America?" The administrator smiled sadly. "The war won't last forever, Nurse Yamada. When it ends, we'll need to find ways to move forward. Holding on to hatred forever helps no one. Besides, you've been an asset here. Dr. Harrison speaks highly of your work." Akiko did not know what to say. The idea that she might stay in America, might build a life here, was so strange that she could not even imagine it. And yet the alternative, returning to a ruined Japan, was equally unimaginable. "I need time to think," she said. "Of course, you have time. Just consider it." She left the office in a daze. Outside, the camp was alive with activity. Children playing, families gathering for lunch, the ordinary bustle of life continuing even in captivity. She found herself walking to the edge of the camp, to the fence that separated them from the desert beyond. A guard stood nearby, a young man she recognized, someone who had always been polite, who sometimes smuggled extra cookies to the children. "Nice day," he said, nodding to her. "Yes," she replied. "Very nice." They stood in companionable silence, watching the desert shimmer in the heat. After a while, the guard said, "You know, I've been thinking about after the war, what I'll do, where I'll go. It's strange, planning for a future when so much is uncertain." "What will you do?" Hiko asked. "Go home, I guess. Back to Iowa. My dad has a farm. I'll probably work there, marry my girl if she'll still have me, raise some kids. Simple life, you know? That sounds nice. What about you? What will you do? It was the same question she had been asking herself. I don't know. Maybe stay here. Maybe go back to Japan. Both options feel impossible. The guard nodded. War makes everything impossible. That's its real crime, I think. Not just the killing, but the way it takes away normal choices makes everything complicated. Before the war, you'd just have been a nurse. I'd just have been a farmer's son. Simple. Simple, Akiko echoed. I would like simple again. Me too. They stood together a while longer, an enemy and a guard, both waiting for a war to end so they could become people again. The end, when it came, was both sudden and anticlimactic. In August of 1945, news spread through the camp that a new kind of bomb had been dropped on Hiroshima. A weapon so powerful it had destroyed the entire city in an instant. 3 days later, another bomb hit Nagasaki. 5 days after that, Japan surrendered. The prisoners gathered in the mess hall, listening to the announcement over the radio. Emperor Hirohito's voice crackled through the speakers, telling his people that the war was over, that they must bear the unbearable and endure the unendurable. Some women wept. Others sat in stunned silence. Akiko felt nothing, just a vast emptiness where her emotions should have been. After the broadcast ended, the camp administrator addressed them. The war is over. You are still technically prisoners, but that status will be changing soon. Repatriation efforts will begin within the next few months. Those who wish to return to Japan will be provided transportation. Those who wish to apply for resettlement in the United States may do so, though the process will be lengthy and there are no guarantees. Fumiko gripped Akiko's hand. What will you do? I don't know, Akiko said. What will you do? My husband's family was in Tokyo. They're probably dead. I have nothing to go back to. Fumiko's voice was flat, emotionless. Maybe I'll stay, start over, become American if they'll let me. That seems like betrayal. Maybe, or maybe it's just survival. We've gotten good at that. In the end, Akiko applied to stay. The decision felt less like a choice and more like the only option that made sense. Japan was in ruins, her family's fate unknown. America had fed her when she was starving, treated her illness, given her work that mattered. It was not home, would never be home, but it was a place where she might build something resembling a life. The vetting process took months. She was interviewed repeatedly, her background investigated, her loyalties questioned. She answered honestly, explaining that she had been a civilian nurse, that she had never supported the war, that she simply wanted to practice medicine and live quietly. Eventually, grudgingly, she was approved for residency. In March of 1946, Akiko Yamada walked out of the internment camp a free woman. She carried a single suitcase containing everything she owned, a handful of clothes and a few personal items. Fumiko walked beside her, equally unburdened, equally adrift. They took a bus to San Francisco, the city where they had first arrived as prisoners. The city was celebrating, still drunk on victory, flags and banners everywhere. People stared at them on the bus, 2 Japanese women in cheap dresses, but no one said anything hostile. They were too small, too insignificant to matter now that the war was over. They found a boarding house in Japantown, a neighborhood where other Japanese Americans were slowly returning after their own imprisonment. The landlady was an elderly woman who had lost her son in the war, fighting for America in Italy. She looked at Akiko and Fumiko with something like pity. "You were prisoners?" she asked. "Yes," Akiko said. "So were we. Different kind, but still prisoners." The landlady sighed. "War makes prisoners of everyone, I think. Come in. I have a room available." The room was small but clean, with 2 beds and a window that looked out over the street. It cost more than Akiko could afford, but the landlady agreed to reduce the rent in exchange for Akiko providing medical care to the other residents. That first night in San Francisco, Akiko lay awake listening to the sounds of the city. Somewhere, a jazz band was playing. Cars rumbled past on the street below. People laughed in the building next door. It was all so normal, so alive, so utterly foreign. Fumiko whispered from the other bed, "Do you think we made the right choice?" "I don't know if there was a right choice," Akiko replied. "There was just the choice we made. Will we ever feel like we belong here? Maybe not. But maybe belonging is overrated. Maybe it's enough to just exist, to have a place to sleep and food to eat and work to do. That seems like a sad way to live. Sadder than the alternative?" Fumiko had no answer to that. In the months that followed, Akiko found work at a free clinic in Japantown, treating the poor and the dispossessed, mostly Japanese Americans returning from the camps, but also Chinese immigrants, Filipino workers, anyone who could not afford regular medical care. The work was hard and the pay was minimal, but it was honest and it used her skills, and it felt like penance for surviving when so many had not. She received a letter from her sister in July. The letter was brief, almost businesslike. Her parents were dead, killed in the firebombing of Osaka. Her brother had died in the Philippines. Her sister had survived but was struggling. Food was scarce. Work was scarce. Everything was scarce in the devastated country. She did not ask Akiko to send money, but the implication hung between the lines. Akiko sent what she could, a few dollars folded into an envelope, knowing it was nowhere near enough. She also sent a photograph of herself standing in front of the Golden Gate Bridge, trying to look happy. She did not mention that she had been a prisoner, that she had spent years in camps, that she had been fed by the enemy while her family starved. Some truths were too complicated to put in a letter. Years passed. The strangeness of being Japanese in America slowly dulled into routine. She learned to ignore the stares, the occasional slurs, the way some people would cross the street rather than pass too close to her. She made friends among the other Japanese in the neighborhood, a community of survivors trying to rebuild lives from fragments. Fumiko married an American, a veteran who had served in Europe and come home wounded in body and spirit. They seemed to understand each other in a way that transcended nationality or history. Akiko attended the wedding, a small ceremony in a courthouse, and felt something that might have been happiness for her friend. She never married herself. There had been opportunities, a few men who expressed interest, but she could not imagine letting anyone that close. The war had hollowed something out of her, some capacity for intimacy or trust. She was content with her work, her small room, her quiet life. She sent money to her sister when she could, received brief letters in return that grew less frequent over the years. In 1950, the Korean War began, and suddenly Japanese expertise was valuable again. Akiko found herself recruited to train American medics, teaching them tropical medicine and field surgery techniques she had learned in the Pacific. It was strange, teaching the sons of former enemies, but they were earnest young men, frightened of death and eager to learn anything that might save lives. One of them, a boy from Alabama named Robert, asked her once, "Were you scared?" "During the war. Every day," she admitted. "How did you deal with it?" "I kept working. Fear is useful if it keeps you alert, but destructive if it paralyzes you. So I worked, and I tried not to think too far ahead." "That's good advice," Robert said. "I'll remember that." She watched him deploy to Korea a month later and hoped he would survive. This boy who had been kind to her, who had treated her like a teacher rather than a former enemy. She learned later that he had died in the first month of combat, killed by a mortar round while treating a wounded soldier. She cried for him, this American boy she barely knew, and realized that the war had not ended for her. Not really. It was still creating new tragedies, still demanding sacrifices from people who deserved better. The years continued. The 50s gave way to the 60s, civil rights and cultural revolution, a new generation that did not remember the war or care about the old hatreds. Akiko grew older, her hair graying, her hands developing arthritis that made delicate work difficult. She transitioned from clinical practice to teaching, training new nurses at a local college, passing on knowledge gained through decades of experience. She thought sometimes about that first meal on the San Francisco dock, the smell of bread and pork that had seemed like a hallucination. She thought about how terrified she had been, how certain of her own death. She thought about all the years that had followed, the slow process of building a life in a country that had once been her enemy, and she marveled at the strangeness of it all. In 1973, she became an American citizen. The ceremony was brief and perfunctory. 30 people from 20 different countries reciting the oath of allegiance in heavily accented English. When it was over, she held her naturalization certificate and felt a quiet sense of completion. She was American now, legally and officially, though she had been American in practice for decades. Fumiko, now a grandmother with grown children, threw her a small party. "You're finally one of us," she teased. "I've been one of you," Akiko replied. The paperwork just caught up. But that night, alone in her apartment, she looked at the certificate and thought about everything it represented. She had survived the war, survived captivity, survived the impossible task of building a new identity in a foreign land. She had been fed when she expected to starve, treated kindly when she expected cruelty, given opportunities when she expected only death. The bread had been the beginning of it all, that first taste of mercy that had undermined everything she believed about her enemies. It had been more powerful than any weapon, more persuasive than any propaganda. It had taught her that people were more complex than nations, that kindness could exist even in war, that survival sometimes meant accepting help from unexpected sources. She kept the certificate in a drawer beside a faded photograph of herself as a young nurse in Osaka, a lifetime ago, in a world that no longer existed. Two versions of herself, separated by war and time and an ocean, yet somehow still connected by the unbreakable thread of survival. Outside her window, San Francisco glittered in the evening light, a city that had once been enemy territory and was now simply home. She thought of all the meals she had eaten here, all the bread she had baked and shared, all the patients she had treated, all the small acts of kindness that had built a life from the ruins of war. In the end, she supposed that was what mercy meant. Not grand gestures or dramatic forgiveness, but simply the daily choice to feed the hungry, care for the sick, treat enemies as human beings. It was not complicated or heroic. It was just bread and pork and clean sheets and gentle hands, repeated until they became normal, until they became life itself. She retired in 1978, at the age of 61. Her colleagues threw her a party, presenting her with a plaque thanking her for 32 years of dedicated service. She accepted it with grace, making a short speech about the privilege of serving the community. She did not mention the war or her captivity or the strange journey that had brought her to this place. Some stories were too complicated to share. Fumiko died in 1983 suddenly of a heart attack. Akiko stood at her friend's grave and thought about the long, strange journey they had shared. They had been prisoners together, had survived together, had built lives in a country that had once been their enemy. Now Fumiko was gone, and Akiko felt the loneliness of being the last survivor of a story no one else remembered. She lived quietly through the 80s and into the 90s, watching the world change in ways she could never have imagined. The Cold War ended. Japan became an economic powerhouse. The children and grandchildren of her neighbors knew nothing of internment camps or wartime propaganda. To them, she was just an elderly Japanese woman who had lived in the neighborhood forever. On the 50th anniversary of the war's end, a local newspaper interviewed her. The young reporter, barely out of college, asked what she remembered most about being a prisoner of war. Akiko thought for a long moment. She could have talked about the fear, the propaganda, the years of captivity. She could have talked about losing her family, losing her country, losing everything she had known. But instead, she said simply, "I remember the bread. Fresh bread, still warm with butter melting on top. That was the moment I realized I might survive." The reporter looked confused, as if expecting something more dramatic. But Akiko had nothing more to give. The bread had been everything. It had been the beginning of understanding that her enemies were human, that mercy existed even in war, that survival was possible even when everything seemed lost. She died peacefully in her sleep in 1997, at the age of 80. She left behind no children, no spouse, no immediate family. Her belongings were modest, her savings unremarkable. But in a box beneath her bed, someone found dozens of letters to her sister in Osaka, spanning 5 decades. A one-sided conversation with a woman who had died years before, but whom Akiko had never stopped writing to. And in her kitchen, still warm from that morning, sat a loaf of bread she had baked herself. Even at 80, Even with arthritic hands that could barely knead dough, she had baked bread every week without fail. It was a ritual, a remembrance, a quiet acknowledgement of the meal that had saved her life and changed everything she believed about the world. The bread was never wasted. A neighbor took it, shared it with her family, and they ate it without knowing its significance, without understanding that each slice was a small act of defiance against hatred. A reminder that even in the darkest times, someone had chosen kindness over cruelty, had chosen to feed rather than to starve, had chosen mercy when violence would have been easier. That was Akiko's legacy, not written in any history book or commemorated by any monument. Just bread, warm and simple and life-sustaining, passed from hand to hand, a gift that kept giving long after the giver was gone. In the end, perhaps that was the only victory that mattered, the only truth worth remembering. War could destroy cities and countries and millions of lives, but it could not destroy the simple human impulse to feed the hungry, to care for the suffering, to offer bread to those who had none. And so the story ended where it began, with the smell of fresh bread and the memory of mercy, proving that sometimes the smallest acts of kindness are the ones that echo longest through history, outlasting empires and armies and all the grand ambitions of war.